The clerk's pen scratched across the ledger, the sound loud as a bone snapping in the silence of the room. It was the only sound besides the thin, wheezing breath of the woman who stood before him. Her name was Eliza, and she was 19 years old. Her face, framed by a plain bonnet, was pale as milk, her eyes wide and dark like two deep wells of fear. Beside her stood Silas Blackwood. He was 60, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, his hands thick and calloused from a life of hard labor on a ranch no one ever visited. His silence was a physical presence in the room, a heavy cloak that smothered the snickers of the two men leaning against the far wall. The town sheriff, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, watched with an expression of bored contempt. He was a witness. This was a legal transaction, after all. Silas placed a single worn silver dollar on the clerk's dusty desk. The coin spun for a moment, catching the light, a tiny, lonely star in the grim constellation of the room. The clerk, a man named Peters with watery eyes, took the coin and dropped it into a drawer. He slid the marriage certificate forward. "Sign," he grunted, not looking at either of them. Silas took the offered pen. His large, rough hand, which could break a horse or mend a delicate piece of tack with equal dexterity, moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. He signed his name, Silas J. Blackwood. The ink was stark and black against the paper. He passed the pen to Eliza. Her hand trembled so violently that the nib rattled against the wood of the desk. She took a breath, a shuddering intake of air, and looked at Silas. He did not look back. His gaze was fixed on the grimy window, on the dusty street of the town that had already judged them. She bent her head and scratched her name onto the line, her letters thin and spidery, the signature of a ghost. And with that, it was done. She was his wife, the property of a man 41 years her senior. The two men by the wall let out a low, mocking chuckle. The sheriff grunted, a sound of dismissal. "Right then," he said, tipping his hat an inch. "Congratulations." The word was an insult. Silas said nothing. He simply turned, his worn boots making no sound on the floorboards, and walked toward the door. He paused, waiting for her. Eliza stood frozen for a second, a puppet with its strings cut. Then, with a visible effort, she moved, her feet shuffling as she followed him out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight. The laughter from inside the clerk's office was louder now, open and cruel. It followed them down the steps and into the main street, where faces peered from behind curtains, and men stopped their conversations to stare. They saw a stooped old rancher and the child he had somehow bought for $1. They saw a scandal, a perversion, a joke. They laughed. They pointed. But they did not see the truth. They did not see the terror in Eliza's eyes that had nothing to do with the man beside her, and they did not see the grim, unyielding promise in the set of Silas's jaw. They saw a wedding, but it was a declaration of war. The journey to the Blackwood ranch was carved in silence. The wagon wheels groaned, a constant complaint against the ruts of the deserted road. Dust rose in a fine, choking cloud, settling on Silas's broad shoulders and on the dark fabric of Eliza's dress. She sat rigid on the wagon bench, clutching a small, battered satchel in her lap. It was all she had in the world. Inside was a change of clothes, a brittle photograph of her mother, and a fear so profound it had become a part of her, woven into the very fabric of her being. Silas did not speak. He held the reins loosely in his hands, his knuckles scarred and brown. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the jagged peaks of the mountains that walled his property off from the rest of the world. The landscape grew wilder the farther they traveled from the town. The sparse, sun-scorched plains gave way to rolling hills thick with pine and jagged rock formations that looked like broken teeth. It was a hard, unforgiving land, a place that did not suffer fools or weakness. Eliza watched it pass in a blur, her thoughts a maelstrom. She had traded one cage for another, But she did not yet know the nature of this new prison. She only knew the alternative was a horror she could not bear to contemplate. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon crested a final rise. Below them, nestled in a shallow valley, was the ranch. It was not a grand place. A simple, weathered house of gray timber stood beside a sturdy-looking barn. A series of corrals, their fences in good repair, stretched out beyond. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the stone chimney of the house, a sign of life in the immense stillness. Silas pulled the horses to a halt. The sudden silence was deafening. He climbed down, his movements stiff but sure. He did not offer her a hand. He walked to the back of the wagon and began to unhitch the horses, his actions economical and practiced. Eliza remained on the bench, her muscles locked. This was it, the end of the line. Finally, she slid down, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air here was different, cleaner, sharper, scented with pine and dry earth. It was the air of solitude. Silas led the horses toward the barn without a word. She was left standing alone in the yard, a small lost figure in the vastness of the landscape. After a few moments, he emerged from the barn and walked to the house. The front door creaked open. He stood in the doorway and looked at her. It was not a command, but an invitation. A simple, unspoken statement. This is the place. With hesitant steps, she followed. The inside of the house was as stark as the outside. It was impeccably clean, the floorboards swept, the surfaces free of dust. A long wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the main room, near a large stone hearth. A rifle was mounted above the mantelpiece. It was a man's home, built for function, not comfort. Silas walked through the main room to a closed door. He opened it. "This is yours," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel, unused. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly since the clerk's office. She peered inside. It was a small room, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a single window that looked out onto the mountains. It was a cell, perhaps, but it was a private one. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He stepped back, closing the door and leaving her alone inside. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the satchel falling from her lap. The latch clicked as he secured the front door of the house. She was locked in. Or locked safe. She didn't know which. For the first time in weeks, she was utterly alone, and no one was hunting her. The thought was so overwhelming, so foreign, that she bent over and wept, her sobs silent and agonizing in the quiet of her new room. The first days fell into a rhythm of silence. It was a living thing. That silence, shaped by the vastness of the land and the unspoken chasm between the 2 people who inhabited it. Silas rose before the sun, his movements quiet but deliberate. Eliza would hear the soft scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water from the pump outside, the clink of the coffee pot on the stove. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched her window, he was already gone, a distant figure moving along a fence line or disappearing into the barn. He was a man of ceaseless work. He mended things. Fences that did not seem broken, the leather of a bridle, the handle of an axe. His hands were always busy, always creating, always reinforcing the small world he commanded. Eliza watched him from the window of her room. She watched him for hours. A prisoner studying her jailer, a survivor studying her protector. She could not yet tell which he was. She saw the raw physical competence in every move he made. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He moved like a part of the landscape, as natural and unyielding as the rock and timber around him. Hesitantly, she began to claim her own space within the house. The first day, she did nothing. The second, she swept the floor. The third, she found a larder stocked with flour, beans, and salted pork. She baked bread. The smell filled the silent house, a warm domestic scent that felt alien and intrusive. That evening, when he came in from the fields, He stopped just inside the door, his head tilted slightly, as if he had caught a strange new sound. He looked at the fresh loaf sitting on the table, then at her. He said nothing. They ate their meal in the usual silence, but it felt different. The bread sat between them, a testament, an offering. She took over the cooking, the cleaning, the small tasks that turn a house into a home. It was a way to pay her debt, a way to create a purpose for herself in this strange limbo. She was a wife in name only, a housekeeper by trade. One afternoon, while dusting the mantelpiece, her fingers brushed against a small, half-finished object. It was a bird, carved from a piece of pale pine wood. The wings were only roughed out, the head still a blocky shape, but the curve of its breast was already smooth and perfect. She held it in her palm. It was light, delicate, a thing of potential grace. She wondered about the hands that were shaping it, the same hands that could wrestle a steer to the ground. She placed it back exactly where she had found it, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The next evening, she noticed it had been moved. It sat on the edge of the mantel, turned slightly, as if it were looking at her. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, his face impassive, his eyes on the flames, but he had seen her touch it. He knew she had found this small, hidden piece of him. It was a conversation held without a single word, a fragile thread of connection spun in the echoing quiet of the house. The flour sack was nearly empty. The salt was a hard cake at the bottom of its wooden box. Life on the ranch was a cycle of use and replenishment, and the time for replenishment had come. Silas stood by the door, pulling on his worn coat. The air held the first real chill of autumn. "I'm going to town," he said, his back to her. It was a statement, not a question. She was washing the breakfast dishes, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. "Do you need anything?" The question hung in the air, unexpected. It was the first time he had acknowledged she might have needs of her own. She thought of the town, of the leering faces and the jeering laughter. She thought of the sheriff's cold eyes. The soapy water suddenly felt icy against her skin. She shook her head, her throat tight. "No." He paused for a moment, his hand on the door latch. He seemed about to say something else, but then the moment passed. The door opened and closed, and he was gone. The sound of the wagon wheels faded down the long road. She was alone again. The house felt immense, its silence pressing in on her. She went to the window and watched until the wagon was a tiny speck, swallowed by the horizon. The town, she imagined him there, a solitary, grim figure moving through the streets that had been her personal hell. She pictured the store owner, a portly man named Henderson, his eyes full of sly, greasy questions. "How's the little bride, Silas? Settling in all right?" She could almost hear the whispers of the women as he passed, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes sharp with judgment. Look at him. Must have paid a fortune for her. A man his age. She felt a surge of something hot and unfamiliar in her chest. It was not fear. It was anger. An anger on his behalf. He was enduring the town's scorn for her. The thought was a revelation. He had taken her burden and placed it on his own broad shoulders, carrying it without complaint. She turned from the window, propelled by a restless energy. She couldn't just wait. She couldn't just watch. She went outside into the crisp, cold air. Behind the house was a small, fallow patch of earth where the sun hit for most of the day. It was choked with weeds, the soil hard and packed. In the barn, she had seen old tools hanging on the wall. She found a rusty spade and a hoe. Her hands were soft, uncalloused. The work was brutal. The spade handle bit into her palms. The dry earth fought back. But she worked with a feverish intensity, tearing out the weeds, turning over the stubborn soil one shovelful at a time. Sweat beaded on her forehead and ran down her back. Her muscles screamed. But with every clod of earth she overturned, She felt as if she were fighting back. She was not just waiting. She was not a victim. She was planting a stake in this hard, unforgiving ground. She was making a claim. When Silas's wagon reappeared on the horizon hours later, she was still there, her dress stained with dirt, her face smudged, her hands raw. He pulled the wagon to a halt and sat there for a long moment, just looking. He saw the patch of dark, newly turned earth. He saw the sweat on her brow and the determination in the set of her shoulders. He saw a small, defiant act of creation. It was the first act of hope he had seen in her. He climbed down from the wagon, his movements slow. He unloaded the sacks of flour and salt, carrying them into the house. He returned and stood by the edge of the patch she had cleared. He looked at the soil, then at her. "Ground's hard," he said. "It'll need water." It was not praise, but it was acknowledgment. It was the observation of a fellow worker, a fellow builder. For Eliza, it felt like a benediction. The weather turned. A great, bruised-looking cloud bank rolled in from the north, swallowing the mountains and pressing down on the small valley. The wind began to moan around the corners of the house, a low, mournful sound that promised a storm. The temperature plummeted. Silas brought in armfuls of firewood, stacking them high beside the hearth. He checked the shutters on the windows, securing any that were loose. He moved with a quiet urgency, a man preparing for a long siege. The storm broke just after nightfall. Rain came first, thick, cold drops that hammered against the roof. Then it turned to a driving sleet that rattled the window panes like a handful of pebbles. The wind rose to a furious shriek. It was a wild, violent night, the kind that made the world outside feel like a malevolent entity. Inside, the fire in the hearth was their only defense. It cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, a small bubble of warmth and light against the raging dark. They ate their dinner in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the flames and the roar of the wind. The storm seemed to amplify the tension between them, stripping away the thin veneer of routine and leaving them exposed. After the meal, Silas took his usual seat by the fire, a block of wood and his whittling knife in his hands. Eliza retreated to her room, but she could not sleep. The wind sounded like a voice, screaming things she didn't want to hear. She lay in the dark, her body rigid, listening to the assault on the house. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her. It clawed at the edges of her memory, pulling her back to a dark alley, to a man's wheezing laugh, to a hand grabbing her arm. Sometime after midnight, a scream tore itself from her throat. It was not loud, but it was sharp with terror. "No, let go." She thrashed in her bed, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "Thorn," she whimpered, the name a poisoned dart in the darkness. In the main room, Silas's hands went still. The knife rested on the half-carved wood. He sat perfectly motionless, his head cocked, listening. He heard the muffled sob, the desperate murmur of her voice. Every instinct in him, the protector's instinct that had lain dormant for so many years, screamed of him to go to her, to throw open the door and stand guard against the demons that haunted her sleep. But he did not move. He understood that her room was her sanctuary, the only place in the world that was truly hers. To enter it uninvited would be a violation, another intrusion by a man she did not know. It would break the fragile, unspoken trust they were slowly building. So he sat in the dark, a silent sentinel, his posture rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the arms of his chair. He kept watch over her fear from a distance, respecting the walls she had built around herself. The next morning, the storm had passed. The world was washed clean, the air sharp and cold. A fragile sun shone on a landscape glittering with ice. Eliza emerged from her room, her face pale and drawn. She avoided his eyes. As she prepared breakfast, she found herself constantly glancing toward the long dirt road that led away from the ranch, her gaze scanning the empty horizon. Silas watched her from the table. He drank his coffee, his expression unreadable. Finally, as she placed a plate in front of him, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "No one comes up this road," he said, not looking at her, but at the same empty horizon she had been watching. "Not unless I let them." The words were simple, a plain statement of fact, but for Eliza they were a vow. It was the first time he had acknowledged the threat she carried with her. It was a promise. He was not her jailer. He was her guard. And for the first time, a small crack appeared in the thick wall of her fear, letting in a single, tentative ray of light. The promise was tested sooner than either of them expected. It was a week later, on a clear, cold afternoon. Silas was at the far end of the pasture, his back to the house, resetting a fence post that had been loosened by the storm. He worked with a rhythmic economy, the thud of his mallet a steady heartbeat in the vast quiet. Eliza was in her new garden, covering the turned earth with a layer of mulch she had gathered from the woods. It was then that she saw it, a rider, a dark speck on the distant road, moving steadily toward the ranch. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. It wasn't a townsperson on a farm horse. This horse was different, tall, black, and elegant. The rider sat straight and proud, a figure of authority and arrogance. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who it was. She dropped her trowel and ran, not toward the house, but toward the pasture, toward Silas. He had seen the rider too. He had stopped his work and was standing perfectly still, the heavy mallet held loosely in his right hand. He watched the rider approach, his face a mask of stone. He did not turn as Eliza came to a halt a few yards behind him. He knew she was there. The rider stopped just short of the fence line, deliberately staying off Blackwood land. He was a man in his 40s, handsome in a cruel, sharp-featured way. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a tailored hat. He smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. "Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was smooth, cultured, and laced with contempt. "I am Jedediah Thorne." Silas said nothing. He simply stood there, a bulwark of weathered timber and silent resolve. Thorne's gaze flickered past Silas, landing on Eliza. His smile widened. "I see you found my lost property," he said, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "A bit ragged, perhaps, but nothing that can't be fixed. I've come to collect what is mine." Silas remained silent, his knuckles tightening on the handle of the mallet. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. "I heard about the little arrangement," Thorne continued, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. "A marriage, how quaint. A desperate little gambit. But a piece of paper from a backwater clerk doesn't negate a binding contract. Her father was a man of his word, even if he was a fool. She belongs to me." The silence stretched. The only sound was the wind whispering through the dry grass and the soft stamp of Thorne's expensive horse. Thorne's smile finally faltered, unnerved by the old man's absolute lack of reaction. Silas was not engaging. He was not arguing. He was simply a fact, an obstacle, as unmovable as the mountains behind him. "This isn't over, old man," Thorne spat, his voice losing its smooth veneer. He yanked on the reins, turning the horse sharply. "I'll be back, and I'll bring enough men to tear this pathetic little homestead apart, stick by stick. And when I do, I will take her. You can't protect her forever." He spurred the horse, galloping back the way he had come, leaving a cloud of dust and a lingering poison in the air. Eliza stood trembling, the cold having nothing to do with the autumn air. Silas did not move until Thorne was a speck on the horizon. Only then did he slowly turn to look at her. His eyes were not angry or afraid. They were cold, clear, and full of a grim, hard purpose. The war was no longer a distant threat. It had arrived at their gate. That night, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer a space of awkwardness or unspoken questions. It was a heavy blanket of imminent danger. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered little warmth against the chill that had settled deep in their bones. Silas sat at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle, the soft, metallic clicks of the action echoing in the room. He had not asked for an explanation. He did not need one. He had seen the truth in Thorn's eyes and in Eliza's terror. But Eliza knew she could not remain silent any longer. This was her battle, and he was standing in the line of fire. She had to give him the truth, a weapon to fight with. She rose from her chair by the fire and came to the table, sitting opposite him. He did not look up from his work. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "He was a good man once, before the cards. He owned a shipping business in the East. Thorn was his partner." Silas paused his work, his hand stilling on the rifle. He looked at her now, his gaze steady, waiting. Encouraged by his attention, she continued, the words spilling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "My father ... he made bad decisions. He borrowed money from Thorn, using the business as collateral. When that wasn't enough, he started signing other things away, contracts. He didn't understand what he was doing. Thorn was a shark circling him." She swallowed, her throat dry. "When my mother died, he fell apart completely. He lost everything. The business, the house. At the end, he had nothing left to wager. Nothing except me." She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. He signed a contract. A service indenture. It said that upon his death, I would belong to Thorn, to settle the final debt. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her. When my father died 2 months ago, Thorn came for me. He didn't want a servant. He wanted a possession. He showed me the paper. He laughed. The memory was so vivid, she could almost feel Thorn's breath on her face. I ran. I sold my mother's last piece of jewelry for a ticket on a westward train. I got off in the first town that looked far enough away. This town, her voice cracked. But he found me. His men were everywhere. The sheriff ... he works for Thorn. He was going to hold me until Thorn arrived. I had one night. I heard the men in the saloon talking. They talked about the crazy old recluse, Blackwood, a man who hated the town, who kept to himself. They said you were hard, but that you were an honorable man. That you had once faced down 3 armed claim jumpers over a water dispute and didn't even draw your gun? She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. You were my only chance. I walked out here the next morning. I found you by the barn. One proposed the marriage. I told you it was a matter of life and death. I told you I could pay you $1. She finished, her story laid bare between them. The fire popped, a log settling into the embers. Silas picked up an oilcloth and slowly, deliberately, began wiping down the barrel of the rifle. He seemed to be considering her words, weighing them. Finally, he set the rifle aside. He picked up the half-carved wooden bird from the mantelpiece and his whittling knife. The blade began to move again, peeling away thin curls of wood from the bird's wing. "A piece of paper," he said, his voice low and rough. "That's all it is, his and ours. Just paper." It was not forgiveness. It was not pity. It was a dismissal of Thorn's power and an acceptance of their own pact. In that moment, Eliza knew she had chosen correctly. This quiet, solitary man was the strongest fortress she could have ever hoped to find. The unspoken arrangement, born of desperation and a silver dollar, was now a conscious alliance. The quiet, domestic rhythm of the ranch shattered, replaced by the tense, focused energy of 2 soldiers preparing for a siege. The coming of Thorn had burned away all pretense. They were no longer a strange, mismatched pair playing house. They were partners in a fight for survival. Their work was now a shared, grim purpose. Silas, who had spent a lifetime building and mending, now turned his skills to fortification. He spent a day reinforcing the doors, hammering thick wooden bars across them. He checked the shutters on every window, securing them with new leather straps. He was not a man given to panic. His movements were as deliberate and methodical as ever, but there was a new, hard edge to them. He was turning his home into a fortress, stone by stone, board by board. Eliza, in turn, found a new role for herself. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. She would not be a liability. She would not be a damsel cowering in her room. She retrieved Silas's spare rifle from a tall wooden locker. It was heavy and smelled of oil and disuse. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was a girl, on hunting trips in happier times. The knowledge came back to her now, a grim inheritance. She sat on the porch steps, her hands surprisingly steady, and began to clean the weapon. She broke it down, cleaning each part with a focus that blocked out everything else. Silas watched her for a moment from the barn door, a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or respect in his eyes. He gave a single sharp nod and went back to his work. The nod was all the approval she needed. Their communication was stripped down to its bare essentials. A gesture, a look, a single word. Water. Here. The latch. Secure. They were a well-oiled machine, moving in concert. The long, silent evenings by the fire were gone. Now they sat at the table, the lantern light casting a small golden circle around them. Silas would sharpen his knives or check his ammunition. Eliza would organize medical supplies, bandages torn from old sheets, a bottle of whiskey for antiseptic, a small pouch of medicinal herbs she had learned about from her mother. One evening, as they worked in this tense, shared silence, Silas stopped his work. He held up the wooden bird. It was finished. He had spent weeks on it, in stolen moments of peace. The wings were now delicately carved, poised for flight. The head was turned slightly, its tiny wooden eye seeming to hold a spark of life. He reached across the table and placed it in her hand. It was light and smooth, the pine wood warmed by his touch. She curled her fingers around it. It was a simple, crude thing, a piece of whittled wood. But it was a gift. The first gift she had received in her life that was not a chain, not a payment, not a trap. It was something beautiful, made for no reason other than the act of creation itself. She looked at him, her throat too tight to speak. He simply met her gaze, then picked up his rifle and began to clean it again. The bird in her hand felt like an anchor, a small, solid piece of grace in a world that was about to erupt in violence. The town had been a source of mockery, then a place of tense neutrality. Now it became an unwitting player in the unfolding drama. Jedediah Thorne was not a man to be trifled with, and his influence reached even into the dusty streets of this remote settlement. 2 days after his visit, 2 riders appeared on the road. This time, it was not Thorne's elegant black horse, but the tired-looking mounts of the sheriff and his lanky deputy. They rode with a sluggish reluctance, as if on an errand they would rather avoid. Silas saw them coming from a long way off. He was on the roof of the barn, patching a loose shingle. He didn't hurry. He finished hammering the nail, his movements unconcerned, then slowly climbed down the ladder. He met them in the yard, leaning against a porch post, his rifle held loosely in the crook of his arm. He didn't speak, just waited. The sheriff, a man named Cobb, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. His face was slick with sweat, despite the cool air. "Silas," he began, trying for a tone of weary authority, "we're here on official business. Got a complaint from a Mr. Thorne. Says you're holding a young woman here against her will. Says he's concerned for her welfare." Silas's expression did not change. His eyes, narrowed against the sun, were chips of cold granite. "Is that so?" he said. It wasn't a question. "We need to see the girl, Silas," the deputy chimed in, his voice cracking slightly, "just to make sure she's all right. A welfare check." "It's the law. His law," Silas said, his voice flat. "Not mine." Just then, the front door of the house opened. Eliza stepped out onto the porch. She was not the pale, trembling girl they had seen in the clerk's office. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her dress was clean, and she stood tall. There was a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, held with the same casual competence as Silas held his rifle. She looked directly at Sheriff Cobb, her gaze unflinching. The sheriff's jaw went slack. This was not the frightened child he had planned to bully. This was a woman who looked like she knew how to use the weapon she was holding. "I am where I choose to be, Sheriff," Eliza said, her voice ringing out in the clear air. It was not loud, but it was steady and strong, with no trace of fear. "If Mr. Thorne is so concerned for my welfare, he can stop hunting me like an animal. Now, unless you have a warrant signed by a judge, you are trespassing on my husband's land." She used the word husband like a shield or a weapon. It hung in the air, a direct challenge. The sheriff looked from Eliza's resolute face to Silas's cold, waiting eyes. He saw the two rifles. He saw the united front. He was a bully and a coward, paid to enforce Thorne's will, but he was not paid enough to die for it. The bluster went out of him like air from a punctured lung. All right, he mumbled, pulling on his reins. "No need for trouble. Just doing our job." He didn't look either of them in the eye, as he and his deputy turned their horses around and kicked them into a hasty trot, eager to be gone. Eliza and Silas watched them go, standing side by side on the porch. The first skirmish had been won, not with a shot, but with resolve. Word of the confrontation would travel back to town with the sheriff. The story would be told in the saloon, in the general store. The whispers of mockery would begin to change. They would no longer be about a foolish old man and his child bride. They would be about the recluse who stood his ground, and the young woman who stood beside him ready for a fight. The laughter was fading, replaced by a grudging, fearful curiosity. The attack came at night, as Silas had known it would. It came without a moon, under a thick blanket of cloud that smothered the stars, and plunged the valley into an inky, impenetrable blackness. The only light was the low orange glow from the house's shuttered windows. Thorne was not a man for a fair fight. He was a predator who used the dark as a weapon. There were 5 of them, shadows on horseback, moving silently through the trees at the edge of the property. Silas was not asleep. He was sitting in his chair, the rifle across his lap, his senses tuned to the night. He had been waiting. He heard at first not a sound, but a disturbance in the rhythm of the night, the sudden silence of the crickets, a faint, metallic clink from the direction of the western fence. He rose without a sound and moved to the front window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. He saw them, dismounted now, fanning out, dark shapes moving against the slightly less dark backdrop of the land. He turned to Eliza, who was sitting at the table, the shotgun resting on the wood before her. Her face was pale in the lamplight, but her eyes were wide and focused. He didn't need to speak. He just tapped the window and held up 5 fingers. She nodded, her knuckles white where she gripped the shotgun. The first shot did not come from the attackers. It came from the house. One of the figures creeping toward the barn suddenly crumpled, a strangled cry swallowed by the night. Silas had fired through a specially cut hole in the wall, a hunter in his blind. The night erupted. Gunshots shattered the quiet, spitting fire in the darkness. Bullets thudded into the thick timber walls of the house. The assault was fast, brutal, and chaotic. Thorne's men were hired thugs, used to intimidating unarmed men and frightened women. They were not prepared for a fight against a man who knew every rock and shadow of his land, a man who was fighting on his own ground. Silas was not a brawler. He was a force of nature. He moved through the small house with a deadly efficiency, firing from one window, then another, never giving them a fixed target. His shots were measured and precise. Each one was an answer to their chaotic volleys. A window on the far side of the room shattered, glass spraying inward. A man was trying to climb through. Before he was halfway inside, the blast from Eliza's shotgun hit him square in the chest, throwing him backward into the night. She worked the pump action, her movements jerky but effective, her face set in a grim mask. She was not the same person who had trembled in the clerk's office. She had found a strength she never knew she possessed, forged in fear and defiance. The fight was a blur of sharp, violent moments, the roar of gunfire, the splintering of wood, the acrid smell of gunpowder filling the small room. A bullet tore through the wall near Silas's head, showering him with splinters. He didn't flinch. He was a rock in the storm. Another of Thorne's men fell near the corral. A third, trying to provide cover fire, cried out and scrambled back into the darkness, clutching a wounded arm. The furious assault faltered. They had expected a frightened old man and a girl. They had found a fortress defended by 2 unflinching sentinels. The remaining attackers, including Thorne himself, realized their mistake. This was not a quick and easy victory. This was a death trap. The gunfire lessened, then stopped altogether. In the sudden, ringing silence, they heard the sound of horses, retreating in a frantic, panicked gallop. The siege was broken. The silence that descended after the last gunshot was more profound than any that had come before. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, thick with the smell of gunpowder and the aftermath of violence. Outside, the night was still, as if holding its breath. Inside the small, battered house, the air was close and warm. The lantern cast a flickering, unsteady light on the scene. A shattered window let in the cold night air. The walls were scarred with bullet holes. Splintered wood and broken glass littered the floor. It was a wreck, but it was their wreck. They had held it. They had won. Silas stood by the wall, leaning heavily against it. Blood, dark in the lamplight, seeped through the sleeve of his shirt from a deep gash along his forearm. He had been grazed by a bullet or hit by shrapnel from the wall. He looked at the wound with a detached curiosity, as if it belonged to someone else. Eliza moved first. She put the shotgun down on the table, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She saw the blood on his arm, and the tremor in her hands vanished, replaced by a singular focus. She went to the small chest, where she kept her makeshift medical supplies. Without a word, she took a clean cloth, a piece she had torn from her own spare dress days before, and a bottle of whiskey. She approached him, her movements calm and deliberate. He watched her come, his expression unreadable. He did not protest as she gently took his arm. She poured the whiskey over the wound. He winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but he stood perfectly still. The alcohol stung, but it cleaned. She worked with a quiet concentration, her touch gentle but firm as she cleaned the gash, her fingers probing to ensure no splinters remained. Then she took the cloth and expertly wrapped it around his forearm, tying a knot to hold it tight. A simple, functional bandage. When she was finished, her hands rested for a moment on his arm. His skin was warm. His muscles were tense beneath her touch. She looked up at him. Their faces were only inches apart. In his eyes, she saw not just pain and exhaustion, but a flicker of something else, a deep, profound gratitude, and something more, respect. The silence between them in that moment was no longer empty. It was not a chasm of things unsaid. It was full. It was a silence of shared survival, of a battle fought and won together. It was the silence of a bond that had been forged in fire and sealed in blood. The sound of a horse approaching at a walk broke the spell. It was slow, cautious. Silas straightened up, his good hand reaching for his rifle. But then the rider called out. Blackwood! It was the sheriff's voice. A few moments later, Sheriff Cobb appeared in the shattered doorway, his gun drawn but held low. He took in the scene, the damage to the house, the blood on Silas's arm, the dead man lying in the yard just beyond the light of the door. He looked at Silas. He looked at Eliza, standing firm beside him. He saw the bodies of Thorne's ambition lying in the dirt. He was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid one. He knew what had happened here. He knew who the villains were. He also knew that the official story would be a complicated, messy affair. He looked at the two figures standing in the ruins of their home, unbowed and unbroken. He made a decision. He slowly, deliberately, holstered his pistol. "Looks like you had some trouble with coyotes, Silas," he said, his voice flat. He turned his horse without another word and rode back into the darkness, choosing to see nothing, to report nothing. The law of the town had officially abandoned them. But as they stood together in the wreckage, they knew they didn't need it. They had each other. The seasons turned. The raw, violent night of the attack gave way to the harsh grip of winter. The snows came, blanketing the valley in a deep, cleansing white. The scars on the house were repaired. New glass was fitted into the window frame. A new door, thicker than the last, was hung on its hinges. The physical wounds healed. The gash on Silas's arm became a thin silver line on his weathered skin. The deeper wounds, the ones on the inside, began to heal too, slowly, imperceptibly, like the frozen ground thawing under the distant promise of the sun. The silence returned to the ranch, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was comfortable, easy. It was the silence of people who understood each other without the need for words. They moved around the small house in a familiar domestic orbit, their paths crossing without collision. They were a unit, a team. When the snows finally melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the damp earth, it felt like a resurrection. Eliza's garden, the one she had carved from the hard ground with such fierce determination, began to thrive. She planted seeds they had bought on a trip to town beans and corn and squash. The town was different now, too. The whispers and the laughter were gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. When the wagon carrying the old rancher and his young wife rolled down the main street, people no longer saw a scandal. They saw survivors. They saw the truth, or at least a version of it they could understand. They saw two people who had faced down Jedediah Thorne and his guns, and won. They saw a strength that shamed their petty judgments. They would see Silas and Eliza in the general store, not speaking much, but moving together, a silent question from him answered by a nod from her. They saw them not as a strange, mismatched couple, but as two parts of a whole. The mockery had died that violent night, and in its place, a legend had begun to grow. One quiet evening in late spring, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eliza was putting away the supper dishes. She noticed something new on the mantelpiece, beside the wooden bird he had carved for her. It was a small oval frame of tarnished silver. Inside was a faded photograph, the edges soft with age. It showed a woman with a kind smile, her hair piled high on her head, and a small boy with serious eyes, his hand resting in hers. Silas was standing by the fire, his back to her, looking into the flames. He hadn't said a word about the photograph. He didn't need to. In that silent gesture, she understood the deep, ancient well of his own loss. She understood that in protecting her, he had been doing more than honoring a desperate bargain. He was protecting a memory. He was rebuilding a piece of the family he had lost so long ago. He had been a protector without anyone to protect, a father with no one to father. She had been a survivor without a sanctuary, a daughter with no one to stand for her. They had found each other in the ruins of their lives and built something new. Not a marriage of passion, not a romance for the ages, but something far more rare and durable, a family forged in shared adversity and sealed with unspoken trust. So here ends our story of Silas and Eliza, the old rancher and the young survivor. It is a story that began with a transaction. A single silver dollar slid across a dusty desk, a piece of paper that tied two strangers together in a bond the world could only mock. The town saw an absurdity, a 60-year-old man taking a 19-year-old bride. They laughed at what they could not understand, because it is often easier to jeer at the surface of things than to look for the truth that lies in the deep, quiet places. They could not see the terror that drove a young woman to seek sanctuary in the arms of a recluse, nor could they see the profound, lonely honor that compelled that man to offer it. They saw a cage, but it was a fortress. They saw a prisoner, but she was a partner. They saw a joke, but it was a vow. In the end, what is a family? Is it a name you share? A line of blood that connects you through generations? Or is it something quieter, something stronger, forged not in a church or a clerk's office, but in the crucible of a shared fight? Is it the person who stands with you on the porch when the riders come, the one who cleans your wounds in the dead of night, the one who shares your silence and understands your fear without a word being spoken? Silas and Eliza built their family out of the broken pieces of their pasts, mending each other as they mended the fences of their small, defiant world. Their home was not built on passion, but on a foundation of mutual respect, a quiet promise to stand guard against the darkness. It became a testament to the idea that sometimes the strongest bonds are the ones we choose, the ones we build with our own two hands when the world has given us nothing. Before you go, think on this. Who stands with you when the wind howls and the night is long? For that is where you will find the true meaning of home and the real definition of family.